right, folks, welcome to Nino's Corner TV right there. There it is. Now you can see it. I'm with SGAnon once again. And, folks, it's breaking out everywhere. It seems to be chaos in Portland and in Chicago, just like we said it would happen many, many years ago. SG, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me back, Nino. Good to be here.
Well, I mean, Red October hasn't disappointed. There's a lot going on here and internationally. We have Benjamin Netanyahu bombing again after Trump was hoping to come to a deal. I mean, all things are just breaking apart right now. And folks, before we get into this, let me get that off my shirt. Get your gold. Gold has gone mainstream. You're seeing it everywhere, and prices keep climbing, especially right now. More Americans are turning to gold to protect their wealth. You got to get it right now, folks. I'm telling you, don't be left behind. But how do you take advantage of it? That's where Noble Gold Investments comes in. From rolling over an old 401k into a gold IRA to physical coins and bars delivered to your home. Noble Gold makes it simple, safe, and stress-free, and I need that. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com today to claim your wealth protection kit, folks. It's your wealth protection kit. Noblegoldinvestments.com. Noblegoldinvestments.com. Get started on it today. All right, SG. So, man, here we are. We're in the middle of it. Well, we're not in the middle of it yet. I expect this to escalate all the way into November, December, and who knows when it's going to end. SG, what do you think?
Well, it's really interesting that you should start with that, Nino, because, the whole discussion, I think, on a lot of patriots' minds, really the vast majority of the country over the last 4 to 5 years, has been the pace of these types of events and these types of things, right? A lot of people got woken up in a traumatic and dramatic way. A lot of people, got woken up with the event that happened later in that year, the election. And so what we've got now, gestating over this last 5 years, is this burgeoning desire within the population to just get it over with. Let's just go through this process. We know it's bad. We know it's going to be, unrestful in some areas. We know that there's going to be destabilization, probably in the electronic domain, as well as the physical, real world community domain. So let's just go ahead and get through it, right? And yet at the same time, as we look at that period over the last 5 years, it's become apparent that this really is an all-inclusive mass societal event. This is an awakening that's coming to a theater in a town near you, so to speak, regardless of where you're at, even if you're deep in a deep blue city. And we're seeing that even now with some things happening in Portland. But I want to drill down a little bit on this point because you brought up an interesting, concept. We're in the middle of it, but now we're not really in the middle of it. We're going to be in the middle of it. We've been in the middle, quote unquote, of a broader societal extraction, a mass society pulling out of all of the different cancerous arms and all of the different infiltrative arms and all of the different sleeper cells and, deep networks and shadow networks for a number of years now. And now that we've moved past a great deal or have had a good amount of success with reclaiming a lot of that territory, maybe is a better way to frame it. And I can just refer your audience to thousands of DHS and DOJ press releases about child network interdiction operations that have happened over the last 4 years. Now that we're moving past a great deal of that and have a lot of teeth into it, we're starting to see the real crux of the problem be dragged out. And this is one of the reasons the border was such a major focus over the last 4 years' time. There needed to be a coordinated, for lack of a better term, resistance gradient. There had to be some sort of pushback against the lawful authority and the lawful will of the President of the United States, of the Congress of the United States, of the vast majority of the voters, because it is a republic with some vast majority democratic principles. That is true. It's not a democracy, but there are some of those principles that are drawn into how our system functions. And so there had to be this pushback against that. And now you're seeing that pushback bleed over into law enforcement, into the judiciary, all of 2025. President Bukele from El Salvador actually highlighting in February of 2025 how you cannot overhaul a government entity. You cannot root out systemic corruption if you refuse to root out the very systemic corruption inside the judiciary and the courts that has protected the other areas of systemic corruption, which allowed those seats to be occupied. And so this has been the theme, really, the entirety of this year. What is the authority of the President of the United States? How far are we willing to allow states to push back on things? How far is too far? what qualifies as civil law, what qualifies as needing expanded support, perhaps even from the DOW now, not DOD, formerly DOD, but now the DOW. And these are questions that we're being faced with as a society. And it's, in my opinion, Nino, it is getting more focalized and more escalatory to encourage more people to ask President Trump to do some of the more extraordinary things that will allow these types of unrest situations to be interdicted very, very rapidly, and the true cause of the corruption, which is the bribed political class, to be dragged out from every nook and cranny at every level, because we have to have a society-wide, from the federal all the way down to the local and the towns level, purge, for lack of a better term. There has to be a cleaning out of all of those arenas, or everything that President Trump's government is doing right now is all for naught.
So I always like to say, what we see right here, folks, what you're looking at is years or decades and decades of social engineering to create this army of what I like to call misfits, who do feel righteous and justified, because you have the governors, you have the mayors coming out in these cities saying to fight against ICE, protest against ICE. I mean, they're egging these people on so they feel justified, right, SG? And now you even have the police in Portland standing down, letting them almost taking the side of the protesters.
And actively arresting independent journalists on X, for example, rather than the individuals that are doing the attacking. And so it becomes prima facie. It becomes very obvious that what you have here is not enforcement of the laws of the United States. This is not a local Portland gang of domestic citizenry that is causing this problem. This is not an Oregon-specific problem. And so that argument is immediately neutralized when you have suffered a mass migration invasion over the last 4 years, because a great deal, nearly all of these law enforcement efforts that are coming from the Trump government right now across various state lines are to enforce federal immigration laws. And so what we have here is essentially the assisting with, the complicity with an insurgency, or what you could count as tantamount to a rebellion or a rebellious activity. President Trump actually highlighted in an order from earlier this year, when they were forced to go into L.A. With both the National Guard and the Marine Corps, and he highlighted in a presidential memorandum that there is an extraordinary set of circumstances that exists on the ground in L.A. at this time that constitutes rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. Rebellion is both a civil and military crime, and it can be only military if the rebellion is assisting a foreign invasion. And so what we've got going on, for lack of a better term, is the exposure of the silent invasion apparatus. Who paid for it? How did they get here? Who drove the trucks? Where have they been staying? Who pays for their cellular phones? Who bought their phones and their shoes and their shirts?
Well-oiled, well-lubed, primed machine, man. This is a well-funded machine, no doubt about it. They've been taking their time in this. Like I said, this has been the social engineering. Folks, this is what's been happening for decades to get to this point, right, SG? This has taken decades to get to this final point of collapse.
This is a problem, in my opinion, Nino, that is at least 35 to 45 years old in its current form, going all the way back to the days of the Reagan government. And every presidency since then, of course, has been rife with conflict around the world that destabilizes whole regions. And those regions, of course, then commit mass immigration with an E as they seek to leave the area that's now been destabilized. And so as we look at what's happening here, it is very much a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. It's the conclusion of a broader cycle that has been going on, as you pointed out, a number of decades now. And unfortunately, that cycle has included intelligence infiltration, paramilitarized infiltration, certainly infiltration of an ideological nature. That seems pretty obvious now, even to your most basic observer. There are governmental and state actors embedded within all of this. There are rogue saboteurs across all U.S. law enforcement agencies and institutions that have been embedded with this over the last 30 years. In my opinion, this is one of the reasons that nameless, faceless entity online that we sometimes reference stated multiple times, it had to be this way. It had to be done like this.
Right.
The cancer was just too great to go at it kinetically, one side versus the other. Both sides would crumble and fall to the disease. And so what we now have is the purging, I think, of the larger areas of that disease, the areas that are much more entrenched and have a further longitudinal history. And a good example of this is Portland or Chicago or Memphis. All of them have criminal underbellies that are sort of well known in our national culture as well established, going back 50, 60, 80 years in some cases, Chicago more than 100. And so as we look at this, this is the uprooting of the larger parts of the tree. We've gotten a lot of these other smaller roots, but now we're dragging out the big ones. And what are they exposing? They're exposing all of the problematic elements that have been hiding behind them, such as the Portland PD or such as certain individuals in the LA government, including the mayoral office, that actively resisted the enforcement of federal law, the judges in all of these different circuits that are being showcased out as nothing more than Democrat ideologues. These types of things are being shown out because these larger roots are now being forced to be dealt with.
And, these people, if you really want to look at this, I mean, they do believe a police state is coming. I mean, it's coming. It's here. They do feel justified in this. To them, they are fighting the man. They're poorly researched. They're not very educated. They don't understand. They really believe that fascism is taking over. And look at these guys. I mean, they're threatening looking. I mean, they fit the bill, man. They fit the bill. So you can't blame these people, even though they're poorly educated and they don't really understand what's going on. They don't understand that they're the ones that have been played like a fiddle. Looking at these guys, yeah, it does look like we're bringing in a police state. It does look scary. They're in their masks. It does look like Trump's a fascist. He's playing the role. Brilliant job by the Democrats, right?
Well, I would characterize it as both the Democrats and the DNC and
Right.
that, left ideologue arena. But even more than that, and you mentioned the term social engineering earlier. I like the term social conditioning because it's the exact same thing, but the conditioning is more longitudinal. And it has been a 35 to 40-year psychological operation that has come through U.S. mainstream media, both press and digital, when the digital airwaves finally came on, and of course, cable television and satellite. And so what you have behind that psychological operation is a relatively insular group of people, so-called philanthropic interests out there in the world, that believe themselves to be quite literally the masters of the universe. And all of them align with the more globalistic agenda, which tends to be shown in the Democrat Party far more even than the neocon Republican Party. But I would submit that the neocon Republicans had quite a percentage, quite a proportion of that same overall influence, that same loyalty, if you will. And the point that you made just a second ago with the foot soldiers that are out on the ground and them being poorly researched and essentially unaware that they're being used as fiddles or cogs in the wheel, that is a result of that mass psychological operation over a period now of a generation and a half. And you've got them whipped into a mental state and a series of mechanical neuronal response mechanisms inside the brain that force them into predetermined patterns of thought and conclusion. And that's the entire point of a psychological operation waged against any opponent. You want them to draw a different conclusion than the truth, what the actual conclusion is. And they are... Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying, I'm just pulling up for my audience. Here it is. Judge temporarily blocks National Guard deployment. So people are standing down. So Antifa is feeling empowered. This is dangerous. So this is going to have to lead to Trump signing the Insurrection Act. Correct, SG?
It would not surprise me. I don't want to be hard and fast on that prediction, but it really would not surprise me. And, with that psychological operation and its effects on the population I was just talking about a moment ago, what is the most zealous army that exists? It is the one that does not even realize it is fighting. And so in this particular sense, we have the entirety of that foot soldier gaslit left, supported by things like the judge, like the mayor, like the governor, like all of these different so-called expert, so-called official pulpit areas, which we know from doing the research are simply bought and paid for, much like you would buy a watermelon at the store. And
Right.
So those pulpits supporting that psychological conditioning and that psychological operation, which extends now into law enforcement, judicial circles, certain areas of authority that cannot be allowed to act in rebellion against the government of the United States. And I keep using that term because people have to realize this is going to become a conversation about civil disobedience versus military unrest. And military does not have to mean a camouflaged fighting force with a bunch of lined soldiers and all of their different covers and caps. Militarized can be a terroristic organization, can be a gang, can be a constellation of actors acting in unison with one another And we call that paramilitary, but that's the type of threat that exists with that. And that's where this is going to end up going. So your comment about the Insurrection Act of 1807, I think it would be highly appropriate before this process is over if it continues to escalate at the pace that it is, because it will demonstrate that civilian authorities are simply no longer capable of responding to the growing unrest, because in many dimensions and domains, they are assisting with that very unrest.
Well, look at this. She says ruling puts us on the right side of history. So this lady here, I don't know if this is the mayor who this is. Ruling puts us on the right side of history, and will the fight? Let's see what she says. And will the fight is far from Oregon, far from over. Oregon remains united and ready to defend our values and rights today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. This is a call to war. This is a call to action. I mean, temporary restraining order. President Trump exercises lawful authority to protect federal assets and personnel in Portland, violent riots and attacks on law enforcement. We expect to be vindicated by a higher court. Wow. So this tells me, SG, he's going to have to make some bigger moves here. And we've always said this on my program. Let's take it to Nino'sCorner.tv right now, SG, and let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu and what's to come for Antifa, baby. Because they have been labeled a terrorist organization, and this is only going to escalate in October. SG, you want to go to Nino'sCorner.tv?
Sounds excellent, sir. Thank you for having me.